Hello and welcome to the Holyrood Sources podcast, where we take you inside Scottish politics. I'm Calum Macdonald. Hello. And this is Geoff Aberdein, who was Chief of Staff to the First Minister Alex Salmond. Hello, Geoff.
Good morning.
And Andy Maciver, who was Director of Communications for the Scottish Conservatives. Hello, Andy.
Hello.
Thank you very much for finding us. Whether you are listening on your podcast app or watching on YouTube, please press subscribe. Stick around. We're here at least once a week, and this is the only place you need to get your political analysis in the run-up to the Holyrood election in May. So press subscribe on YouTube, on Apple, on Spotify, or wherever else you have found us. You can get in touch as well on WhatsApp. It's 0333 404 6507. We're saving up loads of your questions and comments. We'll do a special on those in the next couple of weeks, so bear with us on that. Or you can email hello@holyroodsources.com. Jeffrey Aberdein, where are you today? You're not in your usual surroundings.
I'm not. I'm in London. I'm away to speak at the Association for British Insurers annual conference. And I really hope I'm not going to get asked about insurance because we've got the wrong person. But I'm giving a bit of an overview on Scottish politics. I could have just sent them a link to this podcast and saved me the travel fare.
The reason Jeff's telling you that is because they are guns for hire. If you would like commentary from Geoff and Andy, or indeed myself,
well,
I'm
such a good negotiator. I'm not getting a fee for this. Really, it's I might be a gun, but
not for
my fee's not particularly.
He's free to a good home, is what he's saying. Andy, you're at home. You all good? Everything normal in your world at the moment?
No, but I am at home and I am all good.
Great. Well, we'll take that. Okay,
So
good.
all right.
Right, coming up on the podcast, before the end of the pod, you'll hear from the former Scottish Liberal Democrat leader Tavish Scott, reflecting on the life and legacy of Jim Wallace, who sadly died last week. And can I just encourage you to go and watch or listen to our devolution special, our 25 years of devolution special. Scroll back in your feed, because Jim Wallace took part in that, and he was just brilliant in his contributions that night. And indeed, as you'll hear from Tavish Scott, brilliant in his contributions to the foundation of the devolved Parliament, and I suppose the 26 years since that as well.
Without a spoiler alert, Callum, Jim Wallace was a better negotiator than Geoff is, given that he's now in London with no fee.
That seems clear at this point.
I think that's a given.
So yeah, stay with us. You'll hear from Tavish Scott. Also on the podcast today, we're hearing from Chris Hurd from First Base, the general manager at First Base, from Aberdein, but had to go to the US to secure investment for what he reckons is going to be a 9-figure turnover this year in his company, because he reckons Scotland just isn't quite the right environment for scaling up a company like his. So we're asking whether Scotland is a good place to start a business. You'll hear from Chris Hurd on the pod as well. Right, let's do some politics with these two, first of all. And in the Times this morning, John Swinney's hopes of claiming an outright Holyrood majority receiving a boost after it emerged that the Scottish Greens will give the SNP a clear run at most constituency seats. The Times reports that senior insiders at Holyrood, smaller pro-independence parties, how they describe the Scottish Greens, reveal that they expect to stand in only a dozen or so of the 73 first-past-the-post seats at May's election. Instead, they're going to focus on picking up MSPs on regional lists. Right, who wants to go first on the dynamics of this? Andy, shall I come to you? What does this mean? What is the purpose of this? What is the likely outcome of this? What do you reckon?
It is meaningful. There isn't any question about that, because if you're somebody who might be inclined to vote for the Greens, and if you're somebody who might be inclined to vote for the Greens, at least in part because they're a pro-independence party, then obviously this is not going to do the SNP any harm. I'm not sure I would overstate it, though. The Greens primarily get their support through the regional list, and actually the electorate has shown itself in that side of things to be quite sophisticated, because you see in pretty much every poll that Green support goes up considerably from the constituency vote to the regional vote, and in the same way SNP support goes down quite considerably and very considerably actually from the constituency vote to the regional vote. So this might make a difference in some areas, but the difference is not great. The bigger difference that's being made in constituencies everywhere, bigger than the Greens not standing, is that Reform is standing. because Reform are taking very, very chunky amounts of both Tory vote share and Labour vote share. So the SNP might want to pat the Greens on the back a little bit for not standing in constituencies, but the party the SNP really needs to pat on the back much, much harder is the Reform Party, because the fact that they are standing in constituencies is what's going to enable the SNP to win lots of constituencies on a vote share that's maybe 10 to 15% lower than it was the last time. So the real friends to the SNP in this election are actually Reform, not the Greens.
So yes, while there will be 4 candidates from unionist parties, because of Reform UK standing, there will only be 1 pro-independence candidate in most seats. Geoff, does this mean, do you think, that the SNP will therefore, is it making their majority more likely, and therefore their cause for a second referendum more substantive?
Yeah, well, let me take on what Andy said there for a second, because I think this is a really important point to remember, that on all recent polling, pretty much, because the SNP's vote's down on the regional list vote, they're unlikely to pick up any seats on the region, on this polling. So essentially, they have to win big on the constituencies. They have to win big. Now, as we discussed on this podcast when we had the Survation poll and the YouGov poll, it tells us this as well. When you drive down into the data, and some of the seats in the Central Belt, in Glasgow and in the West particularly, Labour and SNP were eaksy-peaksy with the Reform just behind. If the Greens remove themselves from the constituency vote, they're getting about anywhere between sort of 7 and 10% on the constituency vote. If they remove themselves, then yes, just that 1 or 2 or 3% transferring from what was a Green vote previously to the SNP might just mean that the SNP win these constituencies. So it is quite significant in that respect. Totally take the point about what Andy's saying in terms of Reform. Reform are here. Their vote is sticky. It doesn't seem to be going anywhere. We've all kind of suggested that perhaps their bubble will burst. Doesn't look like that's going to happen. They're performing pretty strong on both the constituency and the regional vote, and are set to do reasonably well if this trend continues. And as you pointed out, Calum, that means essentially on the constituency vote, you're going to have 4 parties fighting over that vote, and only 1 pro-independence party. If people are voting along constitutional lines, the SNP should be pleased and relieved.
Andy, it doesn't open open up the prospect of some sort of unionist party deal or agreement, however formal or informal, does it? Do you think?
That has been sort of mooted and talked about a lot. I've always thought it was total pie in the sky, to be honest with you. I've never really seen that happening. Labour blames Better Together and the 2014 referendum for the woes that they have suffered since because of their association with the Tories. Now, I personally think they've probably overstated that quite significantly. I think there are other reasons for their woes other than that. But I think that they have been pretty badly scarred by that. I think the opportunity for them to get into bed with the Tories is pretty non-existent because of that. They can't get into bed with Reform. Tories and Reform are not going to get into bed, at least in Scotland, at least not at the moment. And a lot of this is because, of course, of the dynamics in Westminster. Their Westminster parties won't allow any kind of association of that type anyway in Scotland, even if it was something that they had thought about. So it's been thought about in the past. For what it's worth, I think it would be absolutely dismal for Scottish politics and Scottish public debate if we effectively created a nationalist party and a unionist party, or at least a nationalist tribe and a unionist tribe. That is a movie that we've seen before in different places, and it doesn't have a good ending. I think it would be really, really bad for debate and for the body politic in general.
Okay. Let's go on to another part of the campaign then, shall we? Anas Sarwar saying he will ban biologically male prisoners from female prisons within days if he becomes First Minister. Bear in mind, he whipped his MSPs to vote for Nicola Sturgeon's gender self-ID reforms in 2022. He then abandoned support for that legislation, and then he said on this podcast that had he known then what he knows now, then Scottish Labour would not have backed the legislation. The campaign group For Women Scotland is taking the Scottish Government to court for a third time to try to have the current jails policy, which permits men who claim to identify as female to serve time in female prisons. They are trying to have that ruled unlawful. We're recording on Tuesday, the 3rd of February, and that case, that judicial review, is going to be heard between Tuesday and Thursday this week at the Court of Session. Andy, what do you make of Sarwar's positioning on this? He U-turned after a question from you on this podcast, and here he is now teeing it up really as a campaign issue, isn't he, for this election?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the right thing to say. It makes sense. It's going to resonate with the vast majority of the population just because it's so self-evidently obvious that this should be the case. And I do think that John Swinney and the SNP government have got to be a bit careful on this issue. They had sort of taken some of the sting out of this issue since John took over as leader and First Minister, a little bit of the sting out of it. But they certainly don't want it resurfacing too much. It's still a very live issue. It's still one of those totemic issues that people think about when they think about all the failures and frivolities of the past. This is still the totemic issue that people think about. So I don't think that any hint of support for these policies from the SNP government is very dangerous. Now, there are a lot of people still in government who are fully supportive of the government's previous position, fully supportive of the entire gender ideology drive, and so that is obviously an internal difficulty. But I would think that John will be thinking to himself, I have got to stay off this issue. I just want this issue to go away. I wish we could stop talking about this issue. And he really will, I'm sure, be thinking about any ways possible to make that happen. Because if you look at this in isolation, look, let's be clear, this is not going to help Anas Sarwar do better in this election. We've talked before about what Anas Sarwar's problems are in this election. They're 400 miles south of the Scottish Parliament. But, clearly, on a kind of single issue, if you look at Anas Sarwar's position on this and compare it to the Scottish Government's position on this, clearly it would be a landslide victory for Anas Sarwar on this issue. So on that basis, of course, he's doing the right thing.
Yeah. Let's see how the Scottish Government fare at the Court of Session over the next couple of days. Right, stay with us on the podcast. Still to come, Chris Hurd and Tavish Scott. We'll be right back. I've spent a few minutes on the podcast today considering whether Scotland is a good place to start a business. Just in the last few weeks, there have been so many reports and sets of data that suggest actually it's particularly difficult at the moment. Let's start with Judith Cruikshank, who is the Scotland Board Chair at RBS, saying that with inflation continuing to pressure companies and customers, the latest data in their growth tracker, which are for December, shows steeper increases in input prices at the end of the year, suggesting that margins are tightening. There's also a report from the UK accountancy body, ICAEW, revealing that business confidence in Scotland has slumped to its lowest level in more than 3 years. That's to say nothing, of course, of tax and wage cost increases emanating from changes in UK government policy, which are yet to show up fully. We're talking, of course, about the increase in employer national insurance contributions, which kicked in April last year, but they are sure to have more of an effect in the next financial year. So, is Scotland a good place to start a business? What conditions are required to be able to say yes as the answer to that question? Let's speak to Chris Hurd, who's General Manager at First Base. Hello, Chris.
Hey, Calum. Nice to see you again.
To see you. Yeah, you too. Shall we start here with what is First Base? What it is, what you did, how you started? Just tell us a little bit of the First Base story, I guess.
Yeah, happy to. So I think starting today, First Base is a single platform to equip teams and manage assets globally. And what that really focuses on is the IT equipment that people need to do the best work that they can. We started out doing that to supply remote workers pre-COVID. COVID happens, obviously accelerates the trend that we were betting on by 10 or 15 years overnight. And over the course of the last 4 or 5 years, we've grown to work with some of the fastest growing, most respected and admired technology companies in the world. So people like Spotify, Cloudflare, Wiz, Ramp, Mercury Bank. If you're a fast growing tech company, you probably would use First Base or could use First Base. Yeah. Tried to start that in Scotland, didn't really succeed, moved to the States, and yeah, things turned out quite well.
I think that's kind of why we're exploring this, really, is because you felt you had to, I think it's fair to say, go to the US in order to make this thing work. Why was that? Why did you feel that?
Yeah, I think so. We started out initially building a slightly different business. That was a financial technology company. Couldn't really ever get it to work. Spoke to something like 139 investors between that and then the pivot to First Base. And the general answer was the same, whether we were speaking to people in Scotland or London, which was, this is super ambitious. You're probably not going to do this from here, and somebody in the States is going to do it before you. We heard that from, I think, venture capitalists, angel investment syndicates, individuals. And ultimately that was what transpired. Some of the states did do it, but it was us. We moved there. It turned out quite well. And yeah, I think that question for me has been there since. Why were the conditions such in Scotland that this couldn't materialize there? And yeah, in the last few years, I think I've spoken to a bunch of people and maybe have some clearer answers.
Yeah, and so let's get into those, because I guess maybe one way to do this is what was attractive about the US, what made it work there.
For me, it's just a very different conversation. I think the conversation I had here being more Scotland than the UK, it was very difficult to get people on the same side of the table as you. So almost every conversation started out from the perspective of, okay, but how do we mitigate the risk? How do we stop all that stop the likelihood that this fails? And the reality with most startups is that's not possible, right? A startup's a startup for all the reasons that there is risk. The likelihood that any venture is going to fail is the majority of the time. Whereas when we went to the States, it felt like people were on the same side of the table as us, and really people were dreaming a little bit more. So it wasn't just how do we mitigate the risk, it was how big can this be if everything goes right? And that might seem like quite a small nuance to people that have never been in the space, but actually having people believe is the sort of necessary requirements early on to get anything off the ground.
And just for context, Chris, if I may pry a little, I mean, just put into context how successful First Base is as a company that could have started in Scotland and ultimately didn't.
Yeah, I think we're on the course to reaching 9 figures in revenue. Probably by the end of this year, we'll be within shooting distance of it. We raised just short of $70 million from the world's best investors, so people like Andreessen Horowitz, Kleiner Perkins. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So it's pretty mega. And that's something that had to walk away from Scotland in order to make it work. Is there anything that you sense could change immediately? How do you change the atmosphere in Scotland to make it a good place to start a business?
Yeah, it's sort of this odd dichotomy at the same time, Calum. It's actually like not a terrible place to start a business. So actually, like of all the places in the world, starting here might be easier than almost anywhere. And I mean getting off the starting line, right? So you raise the first 10, 15, 20K, whether it's in grants or some other funding. So that part actually isn't that difficult here. Arguably, it's too easy, actually. So everyone and anyone can actually get access to capital. And it's not clear to me that leads to the level of competition that's required to create great businesses. So that's maybe a slightly different path. The next step beyond that, so raising the first like real institutional investment capital, the next 125 to 250K, I think is arguably harder in Scotland than anywhere else in the world. And that's really the first lump of capital that lets you hire, if you're building a software company, which is obviously the world I come from, that's the first lump of capital that lets you hire 1, 2 engineers. Maybe it lets you scale out operations or some other function. And because it's so hard here, it's not impossible, but because it's so hard and there are so few opportunities to raise that capital from, you end up with the people who are doing it in really punitive ways. So they're giving you 100K for 50% of your business. And the implication or consequence of that is once you get down to the next stage, you're going to raise 1 to 2 million at some valuation of, call it, between $5 and $12 million. You speak to real institutional investors, venture capitalists, and their reaction is dismay that your cap table looks the way it does, to the extent where it's almost uninvestable. And I think what happens in Scotland is those businesses generally have to leave to raise that next tranche. Like 1 to 2 million is hard here. They go and have those conversations. And unless it is a tier 1 business, and I mean in terms of growth rate, the venture capitalists, the investors look at it and they basically say, this cap table is not worth fixing. Therefore, we're not going to spend any more time on it. And I think the problem that we've had in Scotland is that feedback is often given through the lens of, we like the business, we need more data, come back in 6 or 12 months when you've had more opportunity to grow the business. And that's not necessarily the thing that's stopping the investment. The stopping the investment is, I as a venture capitalist can't put 1 or 2 million into this to own 10 or 20%. When somebody who put in 50K 6 months ago owns 50% of the business, it just doesn't make economic sense.
Yeah. Okay. Geoff, how do you feel listening to Chris's story and, hearing that nine figures are on the way by the end of the year, and actually perhaps the conditions in Scotland make it challenging as a place to kind of to progress, certainly at what may be a startup to begin with, but to kind of get to these sorts of levels that we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, sadly, it's all too familiar, frankly. I'm going to say a few words so I remind myself to keep on a train of thought here. So startup to scale up, appetite for risk, access to finance, productivity, innovation, high value manufacturing, right? Those are my train of thought here. So when Chris talks about starting a business, actually, I think Scotland's got reasonably good evidence of that. There's startup support. I think the interesting point, what you said there, maybe it's too easy. At that point, I think there's something in that, but it's the scale up bit that we don't do well at all. It's that scaling up bit that really is where we're seeing businesses fall off a cliff. I've got about a handful of examples right now that I'm working with, trying to get them that access to finance, which brings me to the next point. We do not have an appetite for risk here. And the American culture has long since been able to say, look, we recognize we have to take a risk on you. This is how unicorns grow. This is how businesses flourish. Here, we're much more strict in terms of our unlocking of finance. Why is that? In my opinion, well, I think things changed dramatically after the 2008 financial crash. Every economic indicator says that the UK productivity has been very sluggish. Since then, it's not particularly good. Now, what really unlocks productivity is innovation. Innovation where there's high value manufacturing. So we have in Aberdein, where Chris and I are both from, incidentally, we just found out prior to the call that his uncle runs a chipper, which has saved me from so many hangovers before I go home at night, by the way. I'm just going to say that. Dolphin chipper, right opposite Taxi Rank, superb. Anyway, right. So the point I was getting here, though, is in the city that we're both from originally, there's something called BIRD funding. Now, that is BIRD analysis. Now, it's business enterprise research and development. Now, BIRD is a share of GDP in the northeast of Scotland is way higher than the rest of the national average. And I'm not just talking about Scotland here, I'm talking about the UK. Why is that? Well, that was because of oil and gas, right? And people had that wonderful natural asset, that natural opportunity, and we had innovators in the supply chain making high-level technology. I'm sure Chris and I know heaps of people in this space who've developed their own technology because you had that opportunity. When I talk about oil and gas leaving prematurely and the disastrous policy of our government, I'm actually worried about that innovative supply chain companies going there. They had that opportunity because there was finance there to back them to do it. People were willing to take risk because they recognized that there was this overarching opportunity. Now, that was just unbelievably lucky, I suppose, when you've won the natural lottery. Point here is, how do we translate that success Scotland-wide and UK-wide? And it comes, as I say again, appetite for risk, access to finance, and we need to be more productive through innovation.
So what is that? Is there a kind of, is Scotland struggling because it's small, that there's not the same number of people? What's going on there at the heart?
I'm getting a bit annoyed with this, though, if I'm being honest with you. Scotland, the economic levers largely, right, and this is not a political point, but it's just a fact, monetary policy, international trade, immigration, employment law, corporation tax, national insurance contributions are all set by the UK government. These are the things that really engender economic growth. Could the Scottish government do more? Yes, it could. A hell of a lot more, quite frankly. It could do something around income tax. It could do something around stamp duty or LBTT that would try and unlock more finance in the system. But fundamentally, they do not have the levers at their disposal, apart from Scottish enterprise, to really motivate investment. What I do think the focus needs to be on, and what Chris tells us, is on how can we just bring a pool of investors together to support the startups that have established themselves to scale up to success. That, to me, is the trick here in what we're discussing.
Yeah. Chris, what do you think?
I mean, couldn't agree more. And I'd be even more aggressive on the side of innovation. If you take the historical legacy of Scotland, Scotland is one of the most entrepreneurial nations, not just in the UK or Europe, in the history of the world, right? You think about from the Industrial Revolution onwards, you've got the steam engine, the television, you've got penicillin, you've got the telephone, you've got economics, you've got logarithms. How long have you got, right? I can sit here for the next 20 minutes.
We also invented the overdraft. Very useful for this conversation.
Well, very, very useful for that. And, so I think the consequence of all of those things, including insulin and refrigeration and the overdraft, is Scotland, that like the modern world wouldn't exist without Scotland and our entrepreneurs. And I don't think that's changed, right? Scottish people are some of the best placed in the world to be entrepreneurs just based on our natural being, right? We are resourceful, we're relentless, we'll hit our heads against the wall for as long as possible until it starts to break down. So I think on some level, it's absolutely what we're talking about. It's appetite for risk, it's scale up capital, it's all those things. I think there's also a part of me questions whether, given how successful we've been in oil, like is oil still the natural path forward? You have to think so, right? Oil isn't going anywhere anytime soon unless we're forced to stop extracting it, which has sort of been the case for a while. But part of me wonders, like, alongside oil, is there a case to be made for a new national mission for Scotland? It certainly feels that way in Aberdein without oil. And it's not super clear to me what that is. I think it has to be built on entrepreneurship. It has to be built on business. And I think you look at everything that's happening with AI just now, the case I would make would be for that. You think about all the benefits that we have. You have natural resources, you have renewables, you have all the talent that's here as a consequence of that. And you almost copy paste that onto the AI industry. And to me, you're like, well, actually, there's a super easy answer here. Are we willing to invest in that? If we were, it wouldn't even just be the case of Scotland, because actually you could start to import people here because everything we have at the same time.
Yeah, Chris, can I just come on back on that? Because to finish the point I was trying to make there as well, because I think you've just touched on something really important, is that, you know, I always remind people that when we talk about oil and gas, it's actually what it unlocks in the supply chain. Now, that supply chain can support the acceleration of renewables. So, you know, a lot of technologies are easily transferable here, you know, and I'll give you a great example. Aberdeen's now home to, you know, the world's first national floating innovation centre, where they're basically testing rigs. Companies are testing different rigs, different hexapods, straining systems to support floating wind. As I keep saying on this bloody podcast, is that, the opportunities, the commercialization of those technologies is still some way off. And so what we're doing just now, we're losing a lot of our critical mass, our expertise, our innovators, our entrepreneurs who've done so well in oil and gas before such time that they can transfer and make money out of renewables, because the projects just aren't available at commercial scale. It's absolute madness. And another thing, I'm in London now, as I said earlier, Calum. It's really frustrating. I was having a discussion last night with somebody from the Treasury over dinner. And they were saying, yes, well, our data doesn't show that you're losing jobs in the Northeast. Or sorry, that's what they said. Our data doesn't show that there's economic inactivity in the Northeast. And they're right, it doesn't. But what they're not realizing is that those jobs are not going people that they're going on the dole queue. They're going off to the Middle East. They're going off to Norway. They're going off to America. Just for highly paid jobs. We're losing the talented people that we need. We're losing people like Chris that we need in our ecosystem to develop and commercialize interesting, innovative technological solutions. That's the problem we're facing now. We've got a flight of talent and we've got a flight of capital. And unless we reverse that, we're going to be in real difficulty going forward.
Yeah. Chris, in terms of your own experience then, we've heard about you heading to the US, finding investment, turning this thing into a huge success. Can you sort of help us understand, is there benefit to Scotland today from First Base and what First Base is achieving and has achieved? And is that as as big, I suppose, a contribution as it could have been had the environment in Scotland been more sort of attractive.
Yeah, I think outside of, I still spend the majority of my time here. We have 2 or 3 other people dotted around Aberdein and the rest of the UK. Not really, right? So there's some tax benefit because there's a few jobs that are here. The reality is they could be anywhere in the world. It's sort of happenstance that they're here as opposed to a strategic decision. When you take First Base's footprint, obviously we got acquired last year, so we're inside a much bigger company now. AppDirect's approaching 2,000 people. First Base is around about 100 and just short of 100. I would have loved 90% of those jobs to be here, and I think to Geoff's point, like the flight of jobs is a massive problem, certainly in the Northeast. But I think if you take the sort of a broader spectrum look at Scotland, it's similar, right? What we lack are high-paying jobs, right? And generally, they're going to be in the technology sector, in the service sector, oil and gas sector. Those can go anywhere. They're going to go to the regions that are producing oil. Similar with technology. If you're building technology products, you can be sat anywhere in the world because you do your work on a laptop. Scotland's an incredible place, right? I love living here. It's safe. My kids go to school here. Education's, I think, good relative to many other places in the world. So the reasons why people would come here, they exist, right? But unfortunately, you can't force people out by not doing anything. And I think that's part of the problem. Like, we've made it hard for people to do the things that they want to do here. I think Geoff's obviously got a bunch of friends in the political arena. I have a bunch of friends in the technology sector, particularly British and Scottish people. And it's not that they don't want to be here. Like, let's make that absolutely clear. It's not that they want to leave. It's that the opportunities to build the things that they believe and are capable of doing are just not here. And that's the sad thing, because they actually do want to be here.
And Chris, it's worth saying, I mean, you do quite a bit when you're sort of encouraging others to start businesses and advising and guiding and all that sort of stuff. So the other part of that, I guess, is that Scottish success leads to further Scottish success, because there is a willingness to share experience and expertise, as you've just done on this podcast over the last 20 minutes.
I think so, Calum. I think, unfortunately, and this might be a separate component, we spend a lot of time navel gazing to places that we'll never be able to replicate. So I think it's easy it's easy for people in Scotland, the government, the private sector, the public sector, to sit here and gaze towards the US and say, well, why not replicate Silicon Valley in Scotland?
Yeah.
And it's impossible. There's no world in which anything like that ever happens here. And I think it's fundamentally the wrong way to look, right? If you look the other way, you look east, you look at Estonia or Israel or Scandinavia, and you look at what countries a similar scale to Scotland are doing, how are they able to do what we have failed at? And how are they able to do it in a way that is replicated over not just 1 or 2 years, but over decades, right? And I think it's exactly what you're talking about. It's people that have built something, reinvesting in the community, giving back both in terms of capital and expertise. And when you do it once, like that cycle generally starts to self-propel. So you have one success leads to 3 successes. The key is like having people that have been around these types of businesses who are sat there thinking, well, Chris isn't that smart. Like, I can do what Chris has done. I can work as hard. I've seen what it takes. I now have the relationships. I've been around executives, generally from the States, who have shown me the path. And I think that is it's not a 1 or 2 year thing, right? We can't solve this in sort of one throw of the dice. It's a 5, 10, 15, 20-year things where the investments you make today are going to be the things that pay you back 5 or 10 years from now. And I think that's the thing. Like, there's no one solution here. Like everything else in life, there's no silver bullet. But I think there are small incremental changes you can make everywhere, which 10 or 15 years from now, our kids and our grandkids at least have the choice to stay and build in Scotland, which it feels like they don't have today.
Chris, it's so good to speak to you. Thank you so much. Thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, good to see you guys.
We want to spend a few minutes on the podcast today reflecting on the life and legacy of Lord Wallace, Jim Wallace, who served as Scotland's first ever Deputy First Minister, who has died aged 71. He was a former leader of the Scottish Liberal Democrats. He'd undergone a procedure at the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh and suffered complications afterwards and died last Thursday. His wife, Rosie Wallace, said their family were very shocked, saying it was all so sudden. He was still incredibly active in a whole host of areas. The Scottish Lib Dem leader Alex Cole-Hamilton described Jim Wallace as one of the architects of modern Scotland. To reflect further on the life of Jim Wallace, we are joined by Tavish Scott, who was the Scottish Liberal Democrat leader from 2008 to 2011. Tavish, welcome to the podcast.
Good morning. Nice to see you all.
It's good to speak to you as well. I mean, this did come as a shock, actually, I think, for everyone who was a lot closer to Jim Wallace than I was. I've met him a couple of times, spoke to him a couple of times. How are you reflecting on Jim's legacy?
So I suppose for those of us who've known Jim all our lives, two things, Calum, come to me. Firstly, he is the reason I was in public service. I was a young Anderson High School student in 1983 when he stood for the first time, when he stood and took over from Joe Grimmond. That in itself was quite a challenge. For those of us who do a little bit of political history, Grimmond was a titan of British politics, a man who had audiences with presidents around the world, despite leading a party of 3 MPs. And Jim took his seat over successfully in 1983 against Winnie Ewing, which was no mean achievement either. And I remember the Anderson High School hustings. We were all in our 5th year at school, and Jim was very Jim-like, if I may say so, just on point on everything. A young, very well trained advocate, so you can imagine all the skills that he deployed in a debate. And the debate was. This is when I realised Jim had one heck of a sense of humour, because the debate was best remembered by one of my friends who will remain nameless, but happens to be a professor at Robert Gordon's University and therefore could be tracked down, who asked Winnie Ewing, given there were 3 million unemployed, how come she wanted 2 jobs? And Jim cackled with laughter, to my recollection. The Mrs. Ewing, who I dearly loved, Winnie was a considerable character, of course, in her own right, possibly wasn't quite so enamoured. And from then on, Jim was a friend. Jim offered me my first job after university. I went down and worked I was the Wallace researcher, for those of you who remember the kind of way in which politics used to work. Nowadays, they seem to have thousands of researchers, but in those days, MPs' offices were usually one person plus one secretary. And we got these things, Calum, called letters. We received letters from constituents. I know it seems archaic.
Right.
And Jim, this is where I suppose Jim was a really considerable character. He absolutely attended to constituency casework to every concern of Orcadians and Shetlanders over his tenure as the Member of Parliament. And those were lessons that I learned, that Alistair Carmichael learned, that Liam MacArthur learned. He was a great mentor to all of us, and we grieve his loss.
Yeah. When we refer to him, Tavish, as an architect of modern Scotland as well, I think what you say there about his character surely is part of that, but also the other part of that is around the devolution story.
Yeah, he was a committed Home Ruler. I mean, the Liberal tradition was for Home Rule for Scotland, and he and other colleagues from that period. That's quite an 83 intake, by the way, in 1983 in the House of Commons of Liberal MPs. Some very considerable people were elected for the first time, and Jim came through to become leader after Malcolm Bruce, and then really led it. But he led it in our party because he had very good relationships with Donald Dewar, with other considerable figures, including Michael Forsyth on the Conservative benches. You know, who at that time, of course, was before the 97 election, was Secretary of State, and so those were good relationships. And he therefore, with Labour, with firstly George Robertson and then with Donald, drove that process. And Jim didn't drive in the sense that, you know, he wasn't, as it were, the front seat driver, but he was always the person who picked the right gear in the car. And at times when you needed to accelerate the devolution process, Jim would do that. When times when you needed to take a step back and say, wait a minute, we need to sort that detail out, he was that person. So I think he was a very considerable factor in the establishment of the Scottish Parliament, but at the same time holding the then Labour government to account over just exactly what that bill was that John Sewell mostly and Henry McLeish took through the Laws in the Commons.
Yeah. Andy, I think at this point it's worth just reflecting that Jim Wallace took part in our special event for 25 years, marking 25 years of devolution. And he was on stage there with the likes of Wendy Alexander and Henry McLeish, and they were all reminiscing. And there was something actually incredibly heartwarming about the affection they still had for one another, but also specifically to think and consider about Jim's role in all of this. His ability to remember how those negotiations went and actually how everything felt actually quite civil, and how he was remembering how he had conducted himself and how others had conducted themselves around that negotiating table to try and make devolution work.
Civil, yes, but it was also pretty fiercely intellectual, I would say, at that point as well. And when we came off stage that night a couple of years ago, we all said the same thing, because we had Wendy up there, we had Jim up there, Jack was there, of course Alex Salmond was there with us that night as well, and we all said the same thing, right? We all said, "Wow, these are people of unbelievable substance." And it was funny when Jim died last Thursday. I saw a photograph of David McLetchie, Jim, Alex Salmond and Donald Dewar. And it was quite reflective. I think I went to work for David McLetchie 24 years ago this year. And when you're in there working for these people, you don't necessarily, people are not always legends in their own time. Sometimes you have to reflect a little bit before you see what they were. But I can't stop looking at that photograph. I actually saved it in my phone, of the four of them, Dewar, Salmond, McLetchie and Wallace. And you look and you think, imagine if they were in the Scottish Parliament right now. Imagine how much better the place would be if they were there. I mean, real legends of devolution in all their own ways. And, a figure of absolutely enormous substance Jim Wallace was. And he was great that night when we did our podcast. I mean, he was really, really good. And as I say, huge intellect, huge substance. And I really... He was incredibly Scottish. His liberal traditions, the home rule, the personal responsibility, his Presbyterian upbringing. He was an incredibly Scottish person and just had so many values that a lot of people in this country, I think, would share.
Just on some of that as well, Geoff, I was thinking about the VT that we played, or one of the VTs that we played that night. And actually, one of the shots was of Jim Wallace and Alex Salmond emerging from the count that they were at, sort of almost like arms round each other's shoulders and sort of giving this joint statement to the assembled media. I was like, what an image from history that is. These two people side by side working for the common good of Scotland as they perceived it. It's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, we're in an election year. For Holyrood elections in a few months' time, and I think a lot of our listeners and viewers will not appreciate the effort that was gone in to actually, firstly, have the campaign for the referendum, to then establish the Scottish Parliament. It took a lot of compromise, as we learned on that night. It took a lot of discussion, debate, cajoling. Some egos in there needed massaging. One constant, of course, throughout that was Jim Wallace. And he was a voice of, in my opinion, from my understanding and watching what he said that night, he was the one that was willing to compromise, to bring people together. Now, I just don't know if we'd have been able to have the Scottish Parliament in the form we did without him, frankly. And then one other point, if I may, and I don't want to overstate this because I didn't know Jim well. I think you sometimes get the tendency to say things when you don't really know people, but I met him a few times. But one thing you've got to remember is he was actually acting First Minister on 3 occasions as well. He was always there. He served under 3 First Ministers, Dewar, McLeish and McConnell. He was always relied upon. Now that tells you something about his character, does it not? Reliable, stoic. And I think he's a real loss to our body politic. And you're right. I mean, people like him in the Parliament now would make it a much, much better place. My condolences do go to his family and friends, because I understand this was a shock as well.
Yeah. Tavish, just another one for you on this was, I think, Jim's willingness, again, from my perception, to continue to advise and to guide those that had come after. He was involved in coalition negotiations, wasn't he, between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats back in 2010. I'm sure he was a councillor to you at various points as well. He was still very active in sort of trying to play his part.
He was. Jim knew how to negotiate. Put 2 coalition agreements, firstly with Donald and then with Jack. A bit of a ringside seat on those, just extraordinary periods. He was no light touch. When he needed and wanted something, he just made sure that happened. But he did so in Jim's style, which was not to shout or scream or throw the proverbial toys out. It was actually just patient negotiations. He was formidable in that sense, and I think that's why there was such a good working relationship and a respect between between the figures that you've described from your earlier podcast, people like Wendy and that kind of thing, who are, intellectually very, very bright. Jim enjoyed that debate, enjoyed that, winning that argument, or at least a score draw, as you might say. And there was lots of that. Callum, what's important to remember about the coalition agreement that the London that happened in London was that they didn't listen to Jim enough.
Yes,
because the tuition fees shambles that happened in London wouldn't have happened if Jim had signed off the paper. And I remember signing off, or rather being, literally being that kind of person in those photos where you hand the papers over to make sure that the signature goes on the bottom. And he would still be checking everything right to the last minute. And that was the difference. Jim was also, was a details man, knew the detail mattered, and on key negotiations, he absolutely did that. One other point on that: free personal care was the day that the government nearly fell apart in that early period. And I remember being in the room with Jim and Henry, who was obviously at that time First Minister. I think I'm trying to remember who the Health Secretary was. I think it was Susan. And it was tough going. And Jim eventually said, well, at least we've had a really good go at that. And I thought that was it. I went out and said, oh, gosh, is that it? Is it all over? And the next morning, Jim and Henry got together and sorted out in the way in which Jim wanted.
Amazing. Tavish, thank you very much. Thank you for taking some time to remember Jim Wallace. We really appreciate you joining.
Thank you.